You know, one of the eye-opening and sobering tasks that an historian can perform for a society is to look back at what was intended by, say, a nation's founders, and compare that to what actually ended up happening over the years. Michael Beschloss does this masterfully and sweepingly in his new book, Presidents of War, which looks at how, despite a constitution intended to make it difficult for a president to lead America into war, indeed, the sole power to declare war was given to Congress. Despite that, presidents have gotten us embroiled in wars roughly once in every generation. Now, Michael took his time researching and writing this landmark book, which examines the experiences of 8 presidents from the War of 1812 through the Mexican War, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, World Wars I and II, Korea and Vietnam. The book has been a decade in the making and involved many interviews and the unearthing of new documents, but it also draws on the knowledge and skills Michael has amassed in his 4 decades as a historian and the writing of 9 earlier works. Those works delved into various aspects of the presidencies of Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. And Michael's bestseller, Presidential Courage, 11 years ago, expanded his scholarship to George Washington, John Adams, Andrew Jackson, and Abraham Lincoln as well. Not bad for a Williams College graduate who then went to the Harvard Business School, thinking he might get a job eventually as a foundation executive and just write history on the side. Well, Michael's early success with his first book in 1980 about Kennedy and Roosevelt enabled him to focus on what he really wanted to do, and it wasn't long before he had established himself as a very popular political historian with a gift for both storytelling and insight. Thanks also to his frequent appearances on TV, where he's often being asked to comment on the latest development involving the current or a former occupant of the White House, Michael has become arguably the most recognized presidential historian today. That's quite an achievement, of course. But as a bookseller, what has really impressed me was something I learned about Michael only the other day, and that is his keen interest in how a book looks. Its binding, the type of paper, print font, cover design. He actually knows quite a lot about all this stuff, and you can see, if you just look at Presidents of War and this beautifully embossed cover and examine the binding and the pages, you can see the care and attention to these sorts of details in the very attractive look of the book, which I encourage all of you not just to view, but especially to read. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Michael Beschloss.
That was perfect. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. And I loved you talking about the book. Thank you very much. Can everyone hear okay? Anyway, thank you, Bradley. Thank you so much for what you said and the nice words. Not only one of the eminent great booksellers in America and one of the eminent great journalists in America, but we have something in common. Am I allowed to reveal this? We're both from Chicago, and now there's yes, some Chicago people here, at least people who like Chicago people. There's a little contradiction there because Brad and I have very idealistic views about democracy and American history, and I wish it were not the case that growing up in Chicago, you might see a few things, at least when we were growing up in the city machine of, let's say, the 1960s in Chicago that were maybe not exactly as the founders intended. The old Mayor Daley, you remember, and it always reminds me of at least one Mayor Daley story. This is a problem with having Chicago people here. I'll try to keep this brief. But 1976, Jimmy Carter was running against Gerald Ford, a few of you might remember. And Carter gave this unfortunate interview to Playboy magazine. Anyone remember that? Lust in his heart and all this. And it almost cost Carter the election because his numbers went down, especially in the South, and he had to recover. And for the old Mayor Daley, he basically didn't care who was running for president. He only cared about his local ticket. And so he was worried that if Carter lost, it was going to drag down the machine candidate for Cook County assessor and all these other candidates. So anyway, right after Carter's Playboy interview, the old mayor had a press conference in City Hall, and city reporters were all asking him, what do you think of Carter's Playboy interview? And Mayor Daley kept on saying no comment, and they kept on asking. So finally, to distract them, he took out a picture of himself, the mayor did, and the previous week he had caught this enormous fish in Lake Michigan. And anyone who knows about Chicago in the 1970s, finding any fish alive in Lake Michigan in the 1970s was an accomplishment. So, the reporters looked at that. And finally, a reporter says to him, all right, Mr. Mayor, what does the fish think of Jimmy Carter's Playboy interview? And Daley could not resist this. He said, the fish told me that if he had kept his mouth shut, he wouldn't have gotten caught. And I always thought that was sort of the motto of the city machine in Chicago, keep your mouth shut and you won't get caught. And one example of someone who got caught was, I think it was the local tax assessor, I forget what his name was, but like many others, he was caught and tried and convicted and went to prison for bribes. And he was sort of on the front steps, probably of Cook County Jail or whatever, and he was manacled, his wrists and ankles. And so one of the reporters said, all right, you've been convicted, you're going to prison. Isn't it time that you'll admit that you were guilty of bribery? And he said, I just can't do it. Everyone says I was taking bribes. I always felt sort of like just a barber accepting a tip. And so that was sort of like what it was like in the subculture that we grew up at least around. But in any case, I think when you're in a situation where democracy is not everything that it should be, maybe it makes you appreciate even more a society where democracy is everything that it could be. So that said, I thought I would talk a little bit about the book that Brad was so kind enough to talk about. And another thing I loved him talking about was that he and I share, and I'll bet you that we share with a lot of people here, an interest not only in the content of the book, but that it also be a beautiful object. Did you show the end papers? End papers, an engraving I found of the attack of the British on Washington in 1814 when they burned the Capitol and the White House. And there's a reason that this engraving is here, because that's how the book opens. I thought I'd sort of run through the book and give you an idea of just what it's like and the 9 people I'm writing about, 9 presidents. And what it is it goes through 200 years, and you're all taking your life into your hands by coming here because you figure, as Brad told you, I spent 10 years writing in this book. The book is, 750 pages long? Hope it won't seem that long as you read it. So if I speak tonight in direct proportion to the amount of time this thing took to write and the number of pages in the book, you will all be sitting here petrified. Seven days from now, you'll still be here. So I'll limit this to about a half an hour and would love it if people have questions or comments or corrections. The way the book opens is August of 1814, and James Madison is in Northern Virginia. And he's standing on a cliff, and he's looking across the Potomac River at this hellfire that is there in Washington. He's watching the burning of Washington. And what had happened was that the British invaded, and Madison had been with some of his troops in Bladensburg, Maryland, and the generals had told him, this is time for you to flee. They're going to come after you. They want a battle trophy. If they find you, they will probably hang you. They would love to hang the President of the United States as a sign that they've been able to capture Washington and to demoralize Americans fighting this war of 1812. Dolly Madison famously left the White House. I wish I could report to you that, as with legend, she had George Washington's portrait under her arm. This is the same portrait that's in the White House behind the president as he sometimes speaks. Anyone notice how big that portrait is? It's about 3 times the height of George Washington, it seems, so couldn't very easily fit under her arm. It was actually cut out and rolled up and taken with some other things away, but she was the one who gave the order, get the stuff out so that it will not be burned or taken back to London as another battle trophy. So in any case, James Madison had taken a barge across the river to Northern Virginia. He was running through the dark forest, and from time to time, running and also on a galloping horse, he'd stop the horse and he'd get off the horse, and even though it's dangerous for him to stop, he'd turn around and he was just transfixed by this sight of Washington's burning. And he was also looking for Dolly. They had agreed on a few places of rendezvous, but could not find each other and wondered if they would see each other ever again. So I show this scene at the beginning of the book, and it's to tell an absolutely fascinating story of what happened to him, but also something that is maybe more important, and that is that James Madison had come to this pass because he had gotten America, and he was the moving force getting the country into the War of 1812. Half the country was against it, about half the Congress was against it. A very unpopular war. If I were to ask you the question, what was the most unpopular war in American history? Probably most people would say Vietnam. It wasn't. It was the War of 1812. Madison famously had been one of the framers in Philadelphia who helped to write the Constitution. And one of the things that the founders felt most strongly of all about was they wanted to make sure that this new office, the American presidency, presidents would not turn into monarchs or dictators. And they looked back at Europe. What was the way that dictators behaved? Well, when the king or the dictator became unpopular, he oftentimes would contrive a fake reason for a war. The country would get into war, the people would be united, and they'd go off to war, and there would be some battle victories, and everyone would love the king. The founders wanted to make sure that that would never happen here. So they basically said, we hope that war will be as rare as possible, only when it's absolutely necessary for our security, and also war will be declared not by a president, but by Congress, war declaration. So Madison, who was part of all that, he was the guy, ironically, who was the first one to sort of break that requirement in helping to push the United States into this War of 1812, about which the people were so divided. And it was almost like original sin, the way I write the scene. It was almost rough justice. His torture for having broken what the founders had agreed on was was running through the wilderness of Northern Virginia, wondering if he'd be assassinated by the British, wondering if his beloved Dolly Madison, if he would ever see her again. That's how the book opens. And the way I get through the 200 years is to write about 9 presidents in terms of the most major wars in American history, from Thomas Jefferson to Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. And the reason I don't go beyond Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon is obviously a perfect candidate to write about would be George W. Bush and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Barack Obama. Problem is that after writing about all these other presidents and wars as history with almost all the documentary evidence that's available, papers and diaries and letters and tapes and so on, and also even more than that, hindsight, having at least decades of hindsight so that you could begin to understand all these people and events as history, I found that I couldn't then just sort of leap into Bush and Iraq and Afghanistan where you'd get maybe 5% of the documents you want, and the hindsight would only be a few years. So maybe if you will invite me back in 40 years or so, I can add on Iraq and Afghanistan, and we can finish out the book. In any event, Thomas Jefferson, and I'll just sort of skip through these quickly so my speech is not 7 days long. Jefferson in 1807 had to deal with a crisis that probably very few people know about. Anyone here know about the Chesapeake and the Leopard? All right, I'm glad, because the book opens with that, and I wanted to just, skipping back after the burning of Washington. 1807, we had a ship called the Chesapeake. It was a frigate. The Brits had a ship called the Leopard. And off of Norfolk, there was an encounter. The Leopard fired, and the American ship, the Chesapeake, was defeated. And there were men killed, and this was a huge event in American history. Newspapers wrote about it. This is a humiliation by the British, a terrible attack. And this was a tempest that then came to the White House because many Americans were calling on their president saying, we've got to go to war because the British have done this to us. And Jefferson actually wrote in a letter to a friend, he said, if I had wanted to have a war, I could have just opened my hand and I could have gotten it easily. And he was absolutely right, because people were angry, and it was even a political risk for Jefferson to stand in the way and keep the flames of war under control. The reason he did not go to Congress to ask for a declaration of war was because Jefferson had a philosophical feeling that unless it's absolutely necessary, war is a bad thing. Leads to higher taxes, it helps the party in power, it corrupts a government about which he was so idealistic. So probably of all the people who might have been president in 1807, Jefferson was the only one who could have held back this war that so many Americans wanted. If anyone else had been president, we would see in American history something called the War of 1807. But Jefferson, with great leadership skills, stopped that. And I believe, and I write about it in the book, that people honor Jefferson for a lot of things. They execrate him for a number of things as well, not least his attitudes towards slavery. But one of the reasons I think he should be honored more than he is because he is the one who stopped the slide toward war that could have happened in 1807. Jefferson was followed by his Secretary of State, who was James Madison, and to put my treatment of Madison into a couple words, great founder, atrocious president. Nice man, weak man, kept on getting taken advantage. He was trying to negotiate with the British to keep from going to war. And finally, in the spring of 1812, he gave up. And he said to himself, not only do I think it's hopeless for me to try to stop the movement toward war among many in Congress whom I respect, but also he thought it would be sort of nice. He didn't have a war record, and he found that, this is the way it was done in those days. If he were a wartime commander-in-chief, he could wear a uniform and a little hat with a cockade and a sword at his side, and he thought that looked sort of nice. And so by June of 1812, he went to Congress and asked for war. And the reason for war was basically two things. Number one, he wanted to stop the British from attacking our ships and taking American sailors off and claiming they were British and stealing them and forcing them into the British Navy, which was happening a lot. And also he wanted to steal Canada. And the argument there was the British were attacking us with the help of the American Indians, and so therefore British Canada should become American Canada. So he went to Congress, asked for a war declaration, got it narrowly, and the war began. And a couple weeks later, he got a letter from England saying that the main reason for war, which was the attacks on American ships by the British had agreed to stop. But by then the war had begun and Madison was enjoying it, and he decided, why not let everything go forward? So this war went on, the first big war in American history. It was needless because the reason for the war had gone. It's a famous war. We remember it for instance, on my cover, Battle of Fort McHenry, What is the Battle of Fort McHenry most remembered for? Star-Spangled Banner. A lawyer named Francis Scott Key, who lived in Georgetown. He was there, so we remember that. Don't give up the ship, Old Ironsides, Andrew Jackson's victory in New Orleans. We remember the War of 1812 as this glorious episode, and it was told that way pretty quickly. Did we win or lose? How many say win? How many say lose? Because our purposes of war was to stop the British from harassing us and also to steal Canada. Anyone been to Canada lately? Still there. So it was essentially a really, Madison, although this great founder, was a terrible role model because he presided over this war that we did not win, that violated what the founders wanted to see in a major war, and it encouraged later presidents to go to war. For example, James K. Polk, who, as it happens, carried around a cane that was carved with scenes of the War of 1812 and the Battle of Fort McHenry. So almost every day he thought of the War of 1812, which he considered this glorious victory that enhances a president if you go to war. And in 1846, Polk did something that was much more terrible. Those who know about Polk, he was a liar, and he was a cheat, and he was a bully. And those were probably his good qualities. And in 1846, he wanted a big war with Mexico. And why did he want to go to war with Mexico? He felt that if we had a big war with Mexico and American soldiers marched all the way to Mexico City, then in the peace settlement, we could say to Mexico, part of what we want are almost 1 million square miles of your territory, New Mexico, what was called Upper California, and other little bits. He wanted to make this into a continental nation. Perfectly worthy aim, but the problem was that he did it by cheating and lying. What he did was he fabricated an incident on the Mexican border, 1846, sent American soldiers down to provoke Mexicans to cross the Rio Grande and respond. And then he basically said to Congress, we have been attacked by Mexico, we have to go to war. And there was a fever, and many Americans volunteered to go to this war against Mexico. And it lasted for about 2 years. We won. We got all that territory, which is great. We're now a nation that was from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But go back to the time of the founders. They were idealistic. They didn't want us to do things that were corrupt and lying like the monarchs of Europe. And what does this sound like? An idealistic young member of Congress stood up and he opposed the Mexican War with great courage. And he said, no one man, no one president should have the right to take America to war. And he also said, President Polk claims that there was an attack by the Mexicans. Show me the spot in Texas where this attack occurred, because I don't think it ever did. And he was absolutely right, this young congressman. And that young congressman's name was Abraham Lincoln. So only about 15 years later, it falls to Lincoln to wage perhaps the most important major war in America's history. He becomes president. He is someone who is so averse to violence that later on, once he was a wartime president, he said to one of his friends, can you imagine me, who cannot even bear to watch a chicken being slaughtered, being responsible for oceans of blood, all these young Americans on both sides being killed? Lincoln was someone who was subject to depression. He was sensitive. From my point of view, his sensitivity is something that is totally admirable in a wartime president. The war presidents that I disparage are those who, like Richard Nixon said, he said to Henry Kissinger, you've got to look at soldiers look like chess pieces. You have to look at it just as mathematics. You can't get yourself emotionally involved in people dying on the battlefield. From my point of view, that's obscene. And Abraham Lincoln was the opposite of that. During the Civil War, there was a moment where there was a need for a national cemetery. Where should it be built? Lincoln said, you know, I've got this house. Anyone been to Lincoln's cottage up the hill from here? Wonderful historic site, has only been restored in maybe the last 17 years or so. That was the place that Lincoln spent about a quarter of his presidency, and he would go up the hill every day during the summer with his family. It was cooler. It was away from the clamor of the White House in those days. President's office was on the second floor of the White House, just among his bedrooms. So Lincoln in the mornings would come out of his bedroom in his nightcap and long gown, and there'd be 90 people in the hallway asking for jobs for their brother-in-law or trying to evade the draft. So he loved the quiet of this cottage up the hill, which is now called Lincoln's Cottage. In the old days, it was called the Old Soldiers' Home. So Lincoln needed to have a national cemetery, and he said, let's build the cemetery near the Old Soldiers' Home so that every time I go up there and every time I come back, I'm going to see the graves of young soldiers being dug. And it's going to be painful for me, and I'm going to know that my decisions led to their deaths, but I never want to be separated from the consequences of these, this is my language, not his, the horrific decisions that I'm making. And Lincoln, at the beginning of the Civil War, didn't start well. This is someone who did not have experience as an executive, no experience in military strategy, maybe a year and a half of formal education. And also, he was a big politician. For instance, one of the scenes I've got is the Battle of Fort Sumter, where Major Robert Anderson and his American soldiers are beleaguered in Fort Sumter out in the harbor outside of Charleston, and the Confederates fire, and they finally succeed in winning, and the American flag is taken down, and Anderson and his men get on a boat and they come back to New York. And Lincoln had nothing to do with Anderson, and the reason is that he thought it would be bad politics for him because Americans probably hated Anderson for losing. He was a Southerner, so maybe they suspected Anderson of being a Confederate sympathizer. So Anderson then goes to New York, and there's an enormous parade and celebration of Anderson in Union Square in New York. About 100,000 people. It was called at the time one of the biggest gatherings of human beings in North America ever. And there were pictures of Anderson on every milk wagon and on the lampposts around Union Square. He was a huge celebrity, and people were honoring him for the fact that despite the fact that he lost at Fort Sumter, you know, he had made this gallant effort. The second Lincoln saw how popular Anderson was, he immediately invited him down to the White House and let it be known that the president was meeting with Anderson because Lincoln at the very beginning wanted to absorb some of Anderson's popularity. This was a politician. But as I tell the story of Lincoln and the Civil War, what is maybe the biggest lesson here? The biggest, from my point of view, is that if we are, God forbid, in the future, looking at any president who wages a major war, make sure it's a president who is able to talk to Americans and explain what he's doing. And in Lincoln's case, he was able to raise the Civil War on a moral level, because although he started this war merely to reunite North and South, by the time of the Gettysburg Address, 1862, 1863, by then he was openly saying that this is a war against the evil of slavery. It made Lincoln a great war president and helped to make this a much more momentous struggle. William McKinley, 1896. Everyone has heard of the American ship, the Maine. Who sunk the Maine? Could I take a vote? Spanish. Boiler accident. It's a boiler accident, but Congress very enthusiastically demanded that the United States go to war with Spain, and McKinley was at the head of that effort because they were convinced, or at least they allowed themselves to be convinced, that this ship had been sunk in Havana Harbor by Spanish terrorists or Spanish people who wanted to commit an atrocity against the people of the United States. And so McKinley authorized a war against Spain that got larger and larger, the modern term mission creep. Perfect example of mission creep. This was not only a vengeance by the United States against Spain for the supposed Spanish attack, but we fought at the Philippines, and we fought to overturn the Spanish dominion of Cuba, and we fought for Puerto Rico, and we fought for Guam and other things. And on the good side, made us a world power. The bad side, you remember I was talking about Polk and the fake Mexican incident that led to the Mexican War. Well, the sinking of the Maine was another fake incident because the Spanish really had no connection with the sinking of the Maine. And once again, we get into a war that accomplishes some good things, but which is fought for phony reasons and a very bad example for later presidents. Woodrow Wilson. I'm not a huge Wilson fan. I hate his views on race, but that's only the beginning. This is a president who was elected twice by very puny margins, really very politically weak, had a good first term, progressive reform, was reelected on the basis of a lie that he knew was a lie. What was Wilson's slogan running for reelection the second time? Anyone remember? We can have some audience response. Anyone remember? What did he say? He kept us out of war, which he did, but it had an implied promise that he would also keep us out of war in the future. And as it happened, he was able to do that in his second term for a couple of weeks, and knew that that was likely to be the case. And Wilson was actually owed his election in 1916, I found, because, and he was reelected by the tiniest of margins. He was reelected, if you analyzed the numbers, election of 1916, women could vote in some states, although the amendment had not yet been ratified that guaranteed the right to vote. And Wilson won. His margin was provided by women in a number of states who voted for Wilson because they hated war and they thought that Wilson was the most likely to keep America out of war. So just the irony that a president who was elected the second time on a lie, largely by women and women who were against war, is the one to take us into war almost immediately as his second term begins. Wilson, for his first year in office, he's remembered for some reason as a president who was just delivering these great eloquent speeches about World War I all the time. Turns out he was almost entirely sequestered in the White House for his first year, barely ever spoke in public, did not explain to people why we were engaged into this war on the other side of the Atlantic. And by the fall of 1918, when the war was won, and we're about to come up on the World War I victory centennial next month, he had done very little to prepare Americans for what he expected as a result. So if you want Wilson as president, you're not getting advanced views on race. You're not getting a president who is elected with a majority that's going to give him political strength. At least you're expecting a president who's going to be eloquent about what the reason for this war is. He doesn't give you that throughout this whole war that takes about a year and a half. So almost suddenly, the second the war is won, November of 1918, he springs us on it. He springs it on us. This is a war to end all wars, a war to make the world safe for democracy. If that is not mission creep, I don't know what the definition of the term is. A war that Americans barely supported at the beginning. And what's more, he's for the noble objective, from my point of view, of a peace organization that will make sure that this never happens again, the League of Nations. So far, so good. But he feels that his negotiating skills, and Wilson was the opposite of a modest man, his negotiating skills are so completely indispensable that no American diplomat can substitute for the president. It's almost an early version of I alone can fix it. someone who professed to be as much of a great Democrat in theory, small d, as Woodrow Wilson should not be the same person who says, I'm the only human being in the United States of America who can negotiate a Paris Treaty to finally end World War I. So because he was so obsessed with himself and his indispensability, he got on the ship with his wife and he spent months in Paris and Versailles negotiating this treaty. And one member of Congress, as I write, was so outraged with the idea of a president leaving his seat, leaving the country for such a long time, he was talking about submitting a bill declaring the office of the presidency vacant. I mean, that was something that didn't happen in those days. No modern communications. But the more important thing is that while Wilson is enjoying himself negotiating in Paris and Versailles, that leaves the field in the United States to his enemies, like Henry Cabot Lodge of Boston, who are going around saying, the last thing we need is a League of Nations of the kind that Wilson is talking about that might give control of our military and our sovereignty to some international organization. Had Wilson had any common sense, he would have stayed home and spent those months explaining to Americans why the League of Nations was in their interest. Had he done so, there's a very good chance, I think, the Senate would have ratified it. Had it ratified the League of Nations, very possibly might have prevented the rise of Adolf Hitler, might have prevented the rise of World War II. So that's Wilson. As I write about the story of Wilson, I write about his Assistant Secretary of the Navy, who was a young man named Franklin Roosevelt. We can do this with sort of, speaker speaks and then crowd response. You can do this, unusual for a history talk. Anyway, you wonder why Roosevelt, in my view, was for the most part a great war president. And the reason is, from my point of view, when I write about this and tell the story, in a way, he had been through it all before. Because in the mid-teens, 1914 and onward, he had two tutors that told him an awful lot about how a chief executive should behave at the time of a great war. One was Woodrow Wilson, his boss, to whom he was quite close, and Roosevelt would watch what Wilson was doing, and Roosevelt would not have disagreed with some of the criticisms I'm making tonight, although he was very eager to butter up Wilson, so he certainly would not have said it to the president. The one person FDR did share his criticisms of Wilson as a war president with was his cousin Theodore Roosevelt, who was still alive and who was in Washington and who had been prevented by Wilson from becoming a volunteer and joining the fight in World War I. So Roosevelt lived through World War I in a high capacity, and so by the time he gets to World War II, it's almost as if you have someone who, in a small sense, had the experience of a former president in wartime. And that's one reason I think, remember I was talking about Lincoln at the beginning? He had just been a railroad lawyer, and suddenly he has to be a commander-in-chief dealing with generals and strategy and how you create an arsenal that produces weapons of war. Roosevelt is at the other end of the spectrum. He has had those experiences. So you look at Roosevelt from Pearl Harbor on, and he makes relatively few mistakes. Two of them, from my point of view, are monumental and have to always be mentioned in the same sentence as praising FDR in World War II. One of them is the internment of the Japanese. And that's a decision that he made pretty quickly, and I tell the story of it early in 1942. And he was dissuaded for a while from doing this by his wonderful wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt felt that it would be a blot against history for FDR to unfairly, she felt, intern the Japanese. She argued with him not to do it, as I tell the story, and he finally abruptly decided to sign that infamous executive order. And it turns out to be a crucial moment in their marriage. In the 1930s, as I quote, Eleanor wrote a letter to a friend, and this shows you how dependent we historians are on written sources like letters and diaries that no one keeps nowadays. So 50 years from now, historians are going to have a problem. But Eleanor Roosevelt wrote these long letters. She wrote one letter to a friend, mid-1930s, one sentence she writes tells you so much about that marriage. She writes, "More and more, I'm convinced that Franklin is a great man, but he treats me like a stranger." That was very much that marriage. And as problematical as that marriage was in the mid-1930s, when FDR interned the Japanese, it began to suggest to her even more. She had before then said, we may have had our emotional connection broken. His famous paramour Lucy Mercer, she had established her distance, but at least I share his ideals and principles. The fact that he would intern the Japanese was a very big moment that suggested to her that maybe they did not even share the same ideals and principles. And another moment that suggested the same thing to her was in the summer of 1944, FDR was given the opportunity to bomb the railroad lines and the concentration camps of Europe. Eleanor was for it. FDR was against it for a lot of reasons. The reason he gave was, he said, if I began to listen to the people who were urging me to bomb the camps and bomb the railroad lines, then Greek Americans will come in and they'll ask me to change war strategy on Greece, and Italian Americans will come in and they'll ask me to do things that have to do with Rome. And what I say as an historian, and Eleanor Roosevelt and Winston Churchill both had the historical imagination to understand at the time, is that the Holocaust was something that was unique in history and loomed larger than almost anything else. FDR in so many ways was a great war president, but on this one he fell extremely short on one of what I see as one of the great moral challenges in American and world history. Two more presidents, then I will be quiet and hope you'll have some questions or comments. Harry Truman, 1950. I love Truman. I think the way he wound down World War II was great. I love his character, his honesty and his modesty and his common sense. As a war president leading us into Korea, I think it was fairly atrocious. And that's for a couple of reasons. Number one is, remember I was talking about war declarations? The founders said to presidents, you want a war, you go to Congress and convince them. You have a long debate, you say how long the war will last, how much money it'll take, how many lives it'll cost. And that way, if the war turns out to be costly, at least Congress, and through Congress, the American people will be on your side, and having, registered their approval, they'll be there. This is my language, not the founders. They'll be there at the beginning, and if there's a crash landing, they will be there as well. Truman, for the most cheap political reasons, decided not to ask Congress for a declaration of war in Korea. And the reason he did it was, in June of 1950, he was facing a midterm election. And he was worried that if he went to Congress, there would be a big acrimonious debate that might be embarrassing to him. So he never bothered to ask Congress even for a serious resolution, let alone a war declaration. And he said, well, my authority for going to Korea is that it's a police action under the United Nations. And the result was that Truman took us to war in Korea, never properly explained it to Americans. For 2.5 years we fought, we were stalemated. Americans wondered why were we suddenly stalemated with this ninth-rate military power in Korea. It led to McCarthyism because people said maybe the reason must be there are Soviet communist agents in our own government who have sold us out. That's the reason that we're losing in Korea. From my point of view, Truman in 1945, at the time that World War II ended, that was Truman the Great. Truman in Korea was, from my point of view, Truman the Small. And especially because by failing to go to Congress for a war declaration, and Truman was the first to decline to do that. Truman established the most horrible example for the last president I will mention, and the last major one in the book, whose name is Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was a young member of Congress, young senator in 1950, watching very carefully what Truman was doing, and he saw Truman basically go to war on his own and ignore Congress. Terrible example for Johnson, because in 1964, in August, Johnson was running against Barry Goldwater. First week of August, and in this book I used a lot of these secret tapes that LBJ made of his private conversations, mainly on the telephone. And you can hear him getting a call from his defense secretary, Robert McNamara, who says, there's a report of an attack on an American ship off of North Vietnam. And so Johnson reacts by basically saying, we've got to bomb hell out of the North Vietnamese because I've got Goldwater calling me soft on communism. He bombs hell out of the North Vietnamese. He goes to Congress and says, there is this terrible, unprovoked attack on an American ship. I need a resolution allowing me to respond militarily. Both houses of Congress give it to him almost unanimously. And LBJ and Richard Nixon spend the next 10 years waging a war in Vietnam, one of the great tragedies in American history. About 60,000 Americans killed, probably 1 million Vietnamese killed, with no more authority than this flimsy Gulf of Tonkin resolution based on a lie. What I've tried to do in this book is write about all these people in a new way, not only my judgments, but also, stories that have not been told before, trying to tell a lot about their marriage. For instance, almost every one of these presidents was blessed by being married to a strong woman who allowed them to function. And some of these presidents had emotional breakdowns, not least LBJ. Lady Bird Johnson, wonderful example of that, who I got to know late in her life. She died in 2007. And one thing that she told me that I got in the book is of how LBJ, she would not use the word bipolar, but he had these enormous lows, very subject to depression. He'd get in bed and pull the covers over his head, almost for days, it seemed to her. And then he'd get too excited and angry when there was good news or news that made him upset. She was very good at calming him down. I think one day there will be a statue, should be, to Lady Bird Johnson for allowing Lyndon to be even less crazy than he was. And he got more loony as the time went on. And by loony, I mean not in terms of mental, emotional illness. I mean in terms of just, his rationality began to fade. And you had a president who by 1967, 1968, and I have it on these tapes, and they're in the book, is telling people the reason why the college students on the campuses are protesting my war, it's because they're being paid in cash by Chinese communists. Well, there were not many Chinese communists in the United States in 1967 to begin with, and they were not giving money to people on the campus. And he would say the reason why the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, William Fulbright, had turned against the war, well, he had been paid off by the Russian ambassador. And Johnson was getting more and more unbalanced, and his ability to separate fact and fiction was getting less and less. You see that also in other presidents, Woodrow Wilson and others. If we have a major war president in the future, always remember that the president you get at the beginning is not the president that you will get at the end. I'll close quickly with one more story. And this is one that was in, I guess, the Sunday New York Times last weekend. But it's one good deed that LBJ committed in Vietnam from my point of view. In January of 1968, American troops were in danger of a bad defeat at Khe Sanh. And William Westmoreland, who from my point of view was not the sharpest knife in the drawer, goes to LBJ secretly and says, I've got a great idea to avert a defeat. How about tactical nuclear weapons? There aren't any in Vietnam, but we can move them in. And this got to Johnson, and Johnson was, to his great credit, irate says no nuclear weapons in Vietnam, and what's more, I want all pieces of paper that even refer to such an idea, I want them brought all together, put in a safe, and made secret. And as a result, these were kept secret for decades, and the last documents were only opened a couple of years ago, which is why I was able to take them and tell this story for the first time. And we all should be harsh on LBJ for being responsible for this great catastrophe in American history of the Vietnam War. But at the same time, now that we know this, we have to honor him for sparing us from the prospect of possibly the Vietnam War going nuclear, in which case it could have led to Russia and China getting directly involved in this war. Both of them had nuclear weapons. In 1968, there is the possibility that what we now know as a civil war in Vietnam, an agricultural country, which we should never have been in, if it were not for LBJ and if a lot of other people had been present at that moment, it might have become nuclear, and that could have been the death of much of the human race. In any event, I will stop there, and if anyone has any questions or comments, I would love to respond. Thank you very much. Hi.
Hello. Mr. Beschloss, thank you so much for being here today.
Pleasure.
I'm a local college student here in the Washington, D.C. area.
Great.
and have had a strong interest in presidential history for several years.
Even better.
When I was pretty young, Taking Charge and Reaching for Glory were some of the first presidential history books that I read, and the books.
These are these books I did on LBJ's tapes. So sorry to keep footnoting; it's pathological.
That's fine. The books really had an important impact on my journey and on my later interests. One thing I was wondering is during the War of 1812, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were the two living former presidents at the time. They both were known to write many letters. Do you know if Adams and Jefferson expressed an opinion on the War of 1812 in writing? And if so, what were their views?
Well, in Adams's case, he was the one who basically lost re-election over the fact that he refused those in his party, the Federalist Party, to go to war with France. So he felt that he was a good influence on Jefferson, although obviously they had parted company. And in Jefferson's case, sort of surprise, even though Jefferson was no longer president, he was this strong character and he was sort of James Madison's mentor, he basically stayed out of Madison's hair. I mean, I've got some excerpts from their private correspondence, but Jefferson figured he was back in Monticello and he was not privy to the kind of, documents that Madison had. So he didn't really presume to advise Madison. He tried to sort of be a friendly influence. And that was a good model for later presidents who, the best of them, have tried, especially when it's a president of their own party, not to sort of tell the successor what to do. Anyway, thank you. It's a really interesting point, and thank you for your nice words about my books. I really appreciate it. Best of luck.
Thank you.
Hi.
Well, I'm not a student. I'm just an old guy who finally has time to read.
I'm all for old guys who have time to read.
I haven't read your book yet, so I don't know if you touch on this or not.
Thanks.
But
It's only been out for 2 days. You're kind of sad.
it's
I'll call you with the quiz tomorrow morning at 8.
recently I finished a book you're probably familiar with, The Sleepwalkers, about prior to World War I. Mm-hmm. And I was really taken back about how complicated the world political and diplomatic situation was, and more taken back by the poor understanding of many world leaders at that time. Mm-hmm. Across your 9 presidents, is there some piece of their poor decision-making by them or their advisors because they really didn't understand what the political and the diplomatic situation was?
Yeah, I think you see that a lot. At the opposite end, FDR really benefited from the fact that, he had been in this business for, 20 years or more. And I would always worry about a neophyte president. I would worry even more about a president who refuses to read history. And even more than that, I would worry about a president who wears it as a badge of honor that he doesn't read anything at all. And the reason for that is that, you become president, especially in modern times, you never have full information. You've always got fragmentary information. You're making 90 different decisions at once, oftentimes on different subjects. And oftentimes, the only guide you've got is, not only understanding of the world, I totally agree with you, but also history. I mean, Harry Truman, ironically, was, I think, just about the best read in presidential history of almost any president who ever served. And the great irony is that Harry Truman, who was, this extremely smart, curious young man, never got a college education because his family was too poor. And the one book he felt he benefited from more than anyone else was a book that was called, totally politically incorrect title, it was called Great Men and Famous Women. The idea that women had no ability to be great, only famous. And I think the subtitle was From Nebuchadnezzar to Sarah Bernhardt. So as you can see, it covered a wide swath of human experience. But what Truman said was, when I had to deal with something like, do I drop the bomb or not? Or do I go to war in Korea? Or do I fire MacArthur? The only thing that really was a user's guide, this is my language, not his, is to find parallels in earlier history that had some similarity to what I was dealing with. And so when he was dealing with some of those crises, I don't think necessarily he thought of Nebuchadnezzar or Sarah Bernhardt, but he'd think of Abraham Lincoln, or he'd think of Andrew Jackson. And there were elements of those problems that he learned from. And this is something that Bradley Graham particularly will not disagree with. Truman always said, not all readers will be leaders, but every leader must be a reader. We have a president who's not a reader. I leave you to your own conclusions. Thank you very much, sir. Hi.
Stoop down for this one. Hello, thank you for coming to speak to us.
Thank you for being here.
My name is Michael, also from Chicago, so share that.
Distinguished name?
Yes.
Distinguished place to come from?
Right, exactly. My question is, you were talking about how you admired how Truman kind of wore down the World War II, and then you were later talking about LBJ's courage in not using these atomic bombs. And there's debate among historians about whether or not Truman should have used the atomic bomb, or whether or not he should have used the second one. And I was just wondering what your opinion was on how that fits into presidential history and how that decision played out or should have played out.
Yeah, everyone has his or her own view. I believe that was necessary to win World War II. It averted an enormous invasion that would have cost very many American lives. I do not feel, as some of the revisionists do, that Truman dropped those two bombs not to win the war, but to scare the Russians. So on that one, I would be very pro-Truman. And that's why, one of the reasons why history is so fascinating is to find, the good and the bad in the same human being. LBJ, who did civil rights and Medicare and some wonderful things, especially in 1965, is the same guy, and I also have this in the book, that did one of the worst things I can ever think of any president doing. And that is, in February of 1965, anyone here remember it was the first month that Johnson began sending troops off to Vietnam in big numbers, month after he was inaugurated. And in public he's saying, I expect us to win this war, and maybe by the end of 1966, he's talking to these idealistic young people and saying, we're going to win this war and go nail the coonskin on the wall, as they said to soldiers in Texas in the old days. And so in private, he's talking to his defense secretary, Robert McNamara, who is not in my Hall of Heroes by any means, quite the opposite for reasons that are too long to go into here. But as we used to say in the third grade, read the book and find out. But he's talking to McNamara, and he says, Johnson does in this private call, I can't think of anything worse than losing the war in Vietnam, and I do not see any way that we can win. That's the first month he's sending these guys off to Vietnam. And just about the worst thing that a president can do, not to be honest about it and to send people into harm's way under false pretenses. And the summer of '65, it's even worse. Lady Bird, whom I got to know well, gave me some of her unpublished diaries, and she has LBJ telling her, I feel about the war as if I'm in a plane that's crashing and I don't have a parachute. That's 1965 at the beginning of that war. And they fought for 8 more long years. That's exactly what a president should not do.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi.
I've heard that Lincoln that he rode a horse from the White House to the summer place.
He did.
And why was he not assassinated sooner?
Well, one day, you may be thinking of this, he was wearing his tall hat and someone shot through the hat and there was a hole in the hat. Unfortunately, he was not shot in the head. A lot of it had to do with, does everyone know about the way that Lincoln entered Washington in 1861? There were rumors of assassination, and he was told to preserve his life, he'd better come into the city in disguise, which he did. He came in by train, and he got off of the train. It was said by some he was wearing a kilt and a tam o' shanter, and others were saying he wore a sheet over his head, which he did not. But this got into the newspapers, and he looked like a coward, and he was extremely embarrassed. And as a result, for the duration of the Civil War, he never had proper security. He sure did not on those trips, and he certainly did not on the night of April 14th, 1865 in Ford's Theater. Thanks, it's an interesting question.
There.
Hi.
My name is Allison. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for being here.
So you touched a bit on gender roles. You talked about how women helped put Wilson in office for his second term and about how all of the presidents that you were writing about had strong spouses. I was curious.
And I wish the spouses had not all been women married to male presidents, but if I come back in 40 years with the additions to my book, I hope I'll be talking about
well, and that was exactly my question, actually. I was sort of wondering what your perspective is about how the world will look different and what will look different when we have our first woman president who has a war happening during her administration.
I hope by that time we will not be so hung up on gender roles that Madam President will have to think about making decisions that are different from those that she might make if those kind of worries were not there. I hope that will be true. What do you think?
I don't know, but I thought I was particularly interested when you talked about the need to have empathy and sensitivity, and that not to think about gender stereotypes,
yes.
But if you sort of think about as a general matter, when women are involved in politics, that does seem to change the nature of decision making and considerations and the like. So I just was sort of curious if there were other things that you came across that you saw as patterns across the presidents that you were looking at.
I think it will depend on the woman herself, but the need to be macho runs through a lot of these presidents. Woodrow Wilson was very painfully conscious that a lot of people looked at him as sort of an effete academic. He didn't mind being this great commander-in-chief, out there being cheered in parades, just like what I was saying about James Madison. Those are very bad influences. Richard Nixon, when he was running the war in Vietnam, a few of you might remember what his favorite film was. Anyone remember? Patton? What message was he trying to send? Those are not great things for the decision of a president of a nation at war. Really interesting point. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think that's it. Thank you all very much for coming, especially through the rain. And